Anna, that's great. Hello everyone. Just to say it's a real pleasure to join you this evening at this joint Caritas Westminster and Sustain event entitled Just Food, How Faith Groups Feed the Hungry and Create a Just Society, ? So I'm hoping we'll have a really interesting conversation this evening. My name is Philomena Cullen, and as Anna said, I'm a Catholic theologian and social policy researcher. And I've really wrestled with this question of what constitutes an adequate faith-based response to the crisis of food poverty and food insecurity that we've witnessed in the UK over the last decade or more. Like Anna, I don't have any answers to that question, which is why I think it's so important for people who are engaged in frontline practice to get together in events like this, to really begin to tease out from our individual practices what some of the collective answers might be. As we all know, the reality of hunger in the UK continues to be widely unacknowledged and hidden. For some reason, it feels easier to believe in people going hungry overseas than it does in the UK. And we all know too how sterile the political debates are around the question of food insecurity. They remain hugely contested, and they're often centred around a really horrible, toxic narrative of the deserving and undeserving poor. The injustice faced by that estimated 8.4 million people in the UK who struggle to reliably put food on the table, with more than half of those regularly going a whole day without eating, is a shocking reality. And it's well known to our panellists this evening, who all in their different ways of responding from different faith perspectives and traditions are trying to do something positive about that really uncomfortable reality. And we know too, don't we, that recent data is suggesting that food insecurity is only going to get worse in the months ahead, with more people getting hungry and experiencing food insecurity in even more severe forms. So the future is looking bleak, which again makes this discussion so timely. Now, I don't know about you, but for me, there are any number of immediate questions for people of faith that arise in my mind as I gaze into that contested perceptions and realities of domestic hunger. Questions such as, is there a role for faith-based emergency food relief in the public square as part of the state's welfare safety net? And if so, what? Or is faith-led emergency food aid inherently demeaning despite providers' best efforts? Does faith-based food aid unwittingly contribute to the problem it's intended to solve? Or can faith-based responses to hunger be a way into addressing the larger structural issues of poverty, racism, and powerlessness for faith groups who are involved on the front line? So really, a really challenging set of questions for us to debate this evening, and we'll hopefully be able to have a good and fruitful conversation around those, especially when we get to the discussion later. I'd like to just briefly introduce you to our four speakers tonight. They've all very kindly agreed to reflect on their own food practice to help us better entangle some of that complexity around direct food relief to people in need and participating in action for structural change around the issue of food insecurity, the charity versus justice tension, if I can sum up our debate in that way. So our first speaker is Hannah Style, who's the founder and chairwoman of Feast With Us. Feast With Us is a London-based food poverty charity which originated in the Jewish community. And Feast brings together surplus food with an army of committed volunteers to provide healthy and nutritious meals for people suffering from food poverty. And Feast, as I was looking at your website, was saying that you were warning in the Evening Standard recently that you fear that more people now will be left hungry during the second wave of COVID-19. So it'll be interesting to hear your timely, up-to-date reflections around that. Our second speaker is Randeep Lal, who's the CEO of Nishcam Sikh Welfare and Awareness Team, or SWAT. This was a charity that was launched back in 2008. And since then, it's grown hugely, as I understand, and it's now in 21 locations, and it's providing something like 4,000 meals per week to the homeless. And along the way, it's because its practice is so outstanding, it's been recognised both with an Outstanding Achievement Award at the Observer Food Awards in 2018, and more recently in 2019, the charity was awarded the Queen's Award for Voluntary Service. So some exemplary practice for us to learn from. Our third speaker is Father Dominic Robinson, who's a Roman Catholic Jesuit priest and chair of Westminster Diocese Justice and Peace Commission. He works to identify and raise issues of injustice, as well as its root causes, in tandem with offering direct food relief through the Central London Catholic Churches Group. I was looking at your recent video message for Homelessness Sunday last week, Father Dominic, and again I was hearing about what you warn is going to be a humanitarian crisis that you're predicting we're going to see in the coming months ahead. So again, some very topical reflections we look forward to from you. And then finally, our fourth speaker is Asim Mulji, who is a founding trustee of Super Northwest London. This is a Brent Borough charity which was established in 2013 to address both the causes and consequences of impoverishment in the community. For Super Northwest London, as you say on your website, it's never just been about food and money. You see yourselves very much as more than a food bank, and besides offering up to 1,800 freshly cooked meals each week to people, you also offer a real array of other services, signposting, advice, edible garden I was particularly interested in, as well as welfare checks, help, laptop, energy bill help, and so on. So a real kind of plethora of support that you're offering. And I was astounded, again, looking at your website, Asim, about your new data that you released in June of this year, that revealed a 202% increase in demand for your service since the start of the pandemic. So again, just that paints a hugely kind of depressing and bleak future ahead. So it'll be really interesting to hear from your frontline practice too. So thank you, speakers. Just to say that our event this evening is designed to be as interactive as possible. It's really designed to be a space for open conversations. So we really encourage you to use that question Q&A function so that I can direct your specific questions to our four practitioner panelists. So the format is we'll hear brief presentations from each of them, and then in the second half of the session we'll open to that broad Q&A session. And I'll field your questions as we go. I'm really sure that we're going to have a really enriching dialogue tonight, where we will all hopefully learn some new approaches and insights from a range of different faith perspectives. So thank you in advance for your contributions to this debate. So without further ado, I'd like to invite our first speaker, Hannah, to share some introductory remarks with us. Thanks, Hannah.
Good evening, everyone. It's a real privilege to be a part of this really esteemed panel of wonderful people doing really important things in the fight against food poverty. I'm going to share my experience as a dietitian in the NHS with this hobby charity that I have on the side, and also my experience as a largely secular but Jewish person from the Jewish community, and talking about the birth of Feast and how it's evolved from the Jewish community into the wider community. So I'm just going to share my screen so that you can see a little show, and I'll be asking Philomena to please cut me off as soon as possible and keep an eye on my timings with me. I think I hopefully can see some of you, the rest of the panelists. Hopefully everyone can see this show now. Everyone can give me a thumbs up if they can. Excellent. Brilliant. So Feast's inception was back when I was a graduate dietitian. I was working in the hospital and leaving work every day and seeing people hungry on the street and thinking, what am I doing in the hospital when there's people who need support, and it doesn't need a dietitian to do it, but it just really stuck out that there were so many people who really needed the nutrition support, and they were without an NHS number and therefore couldn't access dietetic services, let alone any other community services that they might benefit from, without being known to a system. So I was living in a Jewish community house at that time. Some of you may have heard of it, called Moishe House, surrounded by young Jewish social activists who want to do good things. And I was very much around a community of people who were trying to galvanize good. So with that resource available, I walked into a local homeless shelter and said, can I cook for the residents here? And they said, yeah, sure, let's call it Feast, see you next month. I was like, right, okay then, I better go and sort this out and get some food. So I went to the Sainsbury's locally in Kilburn High Street, very near to where Sufra operates, and said, can I take your surplus food, the stuff that's perfectly good, edible, nutritious food that you're throwing away because it's past the sell by or because it has a dent in the package? And they said, yes, we'd love to prevent it going to landfill, have our eggs, you know, the one egg in the box that's cracked, preventing all of the eggs coming being used. So we started to collect that food, and sure enough, the project became a really grassroots initiative, and it went beyond Moishe House, it went beyond my friends and family, but it really became apparent and abundant that there was such a need from the residents, from the supermarkets, and from the volunteers who were presenting themselves. And we see a real need today, particularly in times of lockdown, where more people are made redundant and more people are struggling to put food on the table if they have a table. And we did a service evaluation last year. I'd be very interested to repeat that this year and see how much change there's been. But a horrible large minority of respondents wanted were dependent on feast meals for their main filling meal of the week. It just shows a very bleak reality that there are lots of people suffering, and from a clinical perspective, 1 in 3 patients are admitted with malnutrition, which is again really frightening and not okay. And there's something that we could be doing out in the community, not only to detect malnutrition earlier, but to do something about it and prevent it being a cause for hospital admission. So at Feast, we are all about feeding and empowering now adults and people sustainably together. We have our 3 pillars here, and without any of these key stakeholders, a feast would fail to exist. We're trying to prevent malnutrition. We're trying to promote community cohesion and minimize food waste. And we're using surplus food to feed people who need it the most. And we're marrying all of these goals to meet these societal needs. You'll notice that minimizing food waste and sustainable practices with food are not always achievable for the vulnerable people that we're supporting. It may not be a priority that they are in a privileged position to even think about. So we recognize that people are coming to Feast with different narratives or agendas. So the flow of a feast is such that we collect the surplus food from a multitude of suppliers now. You may have heard of the Phoenix Project or City Harvest, who I'm sure I can see Asim is nodding there. They've been very helpful to us in distributing food that would otherwise go in the bin. But we're also partnered with various cafes and restaurants and supermarkets. It's grown enormously in times of COVID, when we've seen more and more retailers having to close. We take the surplus to local homeless shelters and community centres. We're partnered with Mind, with various mental health community initiatives, and then we collaboratively before lockdown, would create a community meal that we would sit down and eat together as a community, as equals. And that's a very Jewish principle of welcoming the stranger, welcoming the other, let all those who are hungry come and eat. We're not able to do that together in lockdown, but we are providing a food parcel service. And it is shocking how much we've had to do. And I'm sure the other panelists will agree with me, it has absolutely skyrocketed the need and the volume of referrals. And these numbers that you see here are actually outdated, unfortunately. You know, that the numbers are even more shocking than that. During lockdown, we've blossomed into South London, where we weren't before, and new partnership with Haringey, and we're providing more 7-day services and hoping to provide nutrition education in tandem with our immediate food relief. We hope to provide sustainable food education to help people budget and have a healthy, sustainable diet. So there's tons of fantastic work that we're doing on the ground, but it's definitely been a very challenging time to meet the need. I've just put in a very brief slide about some Jewish perspectives on the importance of food as a vehicle bringing people together. The notion that food it should be for everyone, and that I've put in a ladder there in the middle of the page because this refers to the proverb from Rabbi Hillel, looking at the Maimonides, the rungs of charity, and the way to give with the most dignity and the most promotion of independence for the individual that you're giving to, and to the idea that you are providing not only the gift or the tool, the gift that they need, but actually the tool that they need to enable themselves to be independent. So that's where Feast really comes in upskilling the vulnerable adults and people that we support, and trying to provide not just a meal, but the education that comes with it and how to cook for themselves. I'll just say thank you, and please contact us. I'd love to partner with all the panelists here and hopefully some attendees as well. Typically, charities are in a merciless position, desperate for funding at this time in particular. Have a look at that comical tomato. I don't think you'd see that regularly. I just had to put it in there because where else would you find that tomato? I'll leave you with that, and please do get in touch with us if you'd like to volunteer or support with any funding, or if you have any ideas about how we can develop and grow sustainably. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Hannah. That was great and a brilliant introduction, so thank you. Our next speaker now is Randeep, so I'll pass over to you.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you. An absolute pleasure to be here tonight, a privilege to be with you guys. And from what I've just heard from Hannah, I'm really looking forward to seeing what everybody else is doing. Unfortunately, I haven't got a fancy presentation, but you know, I'm going to try and run this off as well as I can, just to give you an understanding of who we are, what we do, why we do what we do, and you know, and hopefully you get a good understanding of what we do. So we are an organisation set up. In fact, I think I'll talk about myself first. My name's Randeep, and my background was IT. I was working for some big blue chip companies, and in 2005 I got made redundant. And I had a question all my whole life while I know I look young, but I'm quite older than I look, but my whole life I had a question, and the question was that, why am I here? What's my purpose of being on this planet? It can't just be that you just suddenly, I appear as Randeep and then I just disappear and I'm forgotten about. This can't be the case of why we are here today. So, you know, am I here to pay my mortgage? Am I here to go to work every single day and think about, and then go home and spend most of my life at work? So there's this continuous question going on in my mind. And in 2005, I was made redundant from work. And then I contacted a couple of charities and I said to them, I need to do something with my life. Send me anywhere in the world you want where I can make a difference in other people's lives. And it actually never happened. And, you know, I still questioned myself and my existence through my faith, which is the Sikh faith. Then what happened in 2000 and in 2009, we were highlighted of a homeless person in my local area. So we were contacted by a drug agency and they said, are you able, so at this time I was working in a youth club, and they said, can you go and see this homeless person and see if you can help this homeless person? They need help. So I went to go and see this homeless person, and when I looked at this person, this was an Indian man, and I think maybe that's what probably hit me. He was an Indian man who was homeless, and you know, an Indian man to be homeless in Southall was pretty much unheard of. So it was a massive shock to me. So I said, look, how did you end up here? What are your issues and what are your problems? And he said, look, because I'm not here legally, I'm here illegally, I need help. And there's not just me, there's another 200 plus mixture of Indians, Pakistanis, Sri Lankans, Eastern Europeans that are hiding away locally, which again, it shocked me. So this is where our project started. So if we talk about Nishkam Swat is the organization that has now evolved from this one homeless person coming to us and saying that, you know, I need help. And he introduced us 200 people. So Nishkam means selfless, and SWAT stands for Sikh Welfare and Awareness Team. So food plays a massive part in who the Sikhs are and what we believe in. So I think there's about 58,000 Sikh temples around the globe, and we're serving around 6 million meals per day through these temples, free of charge. So you can see how this is all tying up now: homelessness, food, a sense of responsibility that we need to do something for these people. So this is where the whole journey started for us. We went out, and from 2009, 10, 11, 12, 4 years, we were going out every single day. I had a team of about 10 to 12 people, and we were giving them basic necessities, food. We were signposting them. We were engaging with the local government, local council, with the police. We were talking to who we could to help these poor people that are in this dire situation. And then in 2012, the 200 or so people kind of got compressed down to a smaller number. And then you can imagine what's happened between 2009 and 2012. We've built up this massive resource. I've got this Facebook page called Help the Southall Homeless. We're now being recognised. People are sending us donations. British Airways are giving us blankets. GlaxoSmithKline were giving us drinks. And I'm thinking to myself, in 2000, so working from 2008, 9, 10, 11, 12, for about 4 years, the last thing I wanted to do was ring up British Airways and ring up Glaxo and say, thank you, but we've done our job. I had this thing inside me which is telling me, this is just the beginning. That was your practice run. Now we're going to go in and do the real work, which is we're going to take this resource. We're not going to turn this resource away. We're going to form a proper organization, and we're going to start looking around the country where people are hungry, why people are hungry, and we're going to start mobilizing and providing food. So I remember the first day in 2012, we had this van. We drove into central London near Charing Cross, parked up, and before you knew it, we had about 20 or 30 people around the van asking for food, clothing, because it had a little sign on there saying helping the homeless. So it very, very quickly, it was like a magnet. So that was it. That was the big, and I can still remember that first day. The second day we went out the week after, there was about 70 people, and this is how the organization grew. So from one van that we had then, we have now about 15 vehicles. From 10 volunteers to 2,000 volunteers from one location. In the UK, we're at 21 locations. That's just in the UK alone. And we have some international projects as well, Africa, India, Argentina, and we've got some coming up. Right, I've been given the nod now, I need to start clicking. So this is basically who we are. And we've got, you know, as well as providing food for the homeless, and it's not just food, there's a magical ingredient within that food, which is love. And without that magical ingredient, you can't make a change in people's lives, and we really, really believe that. We also have a fleet of ambulances, which we take along with our food provisions. So we also do healthcare with professionals looking after the homeless and the less fortunate. And it's not just the homeless that we're feeding. You'll be shocked and you will be surprised. And you can ask me this question later. Who are the people that we're providing these 5,000 meals a week to? And that's just a quick summary of what we do. I mean, I can carry on and on and on. I was actually worried that 7 minutes is too long, but I've just realized that it's not. So I'm going to finish here. I'm going to hand over. So thank you very much. That was a very quick, brief introduction from me.
Thank you, Randy. That was a really inspiring story of the journey that both you and your charity have been on. That was wonderful. Thank you. I pass now to Father Dominic.
Good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here as well. Thank you very much for the invitation. I've not got a particularly snazzy presentation either, but I'm going to tell you first of all the story of the Central London Catholic Churches during the pandemic, and then I'm going to just frame that a little bit in why that's so important to our Christian faith. I'll start our story back in late March, and walking out into the deserted city here in London, it became clear there was a whole underclass there of our population who were being forgotten. And as the Christian community prepared to celebrate Holy Week and Easter behind closed doors, the most important part of the Christian year, with what hope we could muster, there was a huge number of homeless left on the streets of London. Now, just to paint the picture, all offices closed, no workers on the streets. In the midst of this, in pockets around the city, the most desperate, who in the panic of the exodus had simply been left behind without food, as soup runs had to stop for safety's sake. There were no businesses or people to beg from either. So a pretty dreadful situation. And amidst all this, it was also clear that it's important to say there was much being done to address the issues by national and local government. Now, March 29th, important date for me and for the Christian calendar, Palm Sunday. And so it was that date as well, on March 29th, when all homeless left on the streets were going to be housed in hotels and bed and breakfasts. And yet, despite that very partial success, what became clear was that the media was clouding reality. And so what we were hearing through the media, even if it was partly true and partly fake news, became, I think, the true narrative. And so it was imperative for those who were working on the streets to step in, for faith groups to step in, for other homeless agencies, and for Christians. This was just part of what we do. But the question which this webinar's all about, it seemed to me, was it just filling the gaps? Good, generous people helping out? Certainly we did. And I can't emphasize this enough at this present time. That must also involve working hand in hand with civil authorities, local and national government, police, residents, businesses. But what about faith? Where did it come in for this? Where does it come in for me? For me, Palm Sunday is a helpful connector. For the crowd on that first Palm Sunday when Jesus entered Jerusalem, they're surely victim to the phenomenon of fake news. How else would their singing hosannas to their Messiah lead to crucify him within just 5 days? And in the midst of this, recognizing how we're all sinners, not just personally, but socially, as society, as church too, as the human race, I believe that COVID was calling us to a new integrity, which is the greatest form of truth in an age of so much twisted and fake news. That's why I think our leader, Pope Francis, or at least in the Catholic Church our leader, but he has a global reach, is reminding us, especially at this time, we're called not just to contribute to society through what we do, but we're called to take the reins and build a new future which is just. If we're guided by such a vision, the response of the Christian community, along with other faiths, Niscam Swat especially, we're working with in Trafalgar Square, and importantly working together with secular and governmental authorities and organisations, has the opportunity to be prophetic. It's called us to begin to embrace the truth about ourselves and our identity as human beings made in God's image. That's something we share certainly as Jews, as Muslims, as Christians, who are part of wider society, and to embrace what we can be. Now, some have asked why the churches should be involved in this when it's really the job of the local authorities and national government. That seems to get to the heart of what this webinar is about. It's often framed as part of a larger question of why the church should be involved in politics, or be involved in the real world, or have a mission. The answer relates, I think, to how we view our faith in Christ. For me, the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, the founder of my religious order, also Pope Francis' religious order, the Jesuits, teach me to find Christ and my calling right in the heart of the now. And this is simply the call of the Christian gospel. Christ is not to be found just within ourselves, nor in our future hope, but he's in the facts of everyday life. He's there on the streets. Our mission is in the present, in the midst of the battle between good and evil, under our noses, as we're led to uncover the truth and discern what must be done to build that future now. In common with many homeless services, those in the church have a duty to work with local authorities and to hold them to account. As church, we have the duty to advocate for the poor who are without food. Here, the church cannot but be involved in politics, but must be aware that her role must never take on that of party politics. Looking at the facts and advocating for a just future is very much faith groups' role. This isn't an issue to be used as a political football, but an issue of profound importance to everyone of faith, I think, and to the Christian who at this extraordinary time of crisis needs to put aside political views on benefit eligibility and immigration and show the human being in the midst of this the dignity they deserve. So the Christian church is about confidently challenging society and culture on issues of injustice of which we're part. And so the church has the duty to invite us to learn from this dreadful time. We need to keep advocating for this most vulnerable group of people who are getting more and more destitute as the pandemic worsens. And we need to keep our message inspired by the gospel and by our faith. We need to keep it hopeful and in robust dialogue with those who have tough decisions to make on the issues on behalf of society. Above all, to ensure we place the dignity of all made in God's image at the centre of all we do as a society.
Thank you, Father Dominic, for that reflection on the wider role of faith groups too. That's really helpful for our discussion later, and for keeping to time. That was brilliant. Our final speaker now is Asim, so I'll pass to you.
Hi, thank you everyone, and again, thank you for inviting me to this and to be part of this session today. I really appreciate that. I've been introduced already, so I won't go into who I am, but I wanted to start off with a reflection, and the reflection was that religion and faith do not always focus on fighting poverty. They focus on really putting a band-aid, a plaster over the wound, and the wound is being hunger. We always go on about feed the hungry, help them survive, but very rarely we think about how do we get people out of poverty. And if not this generation, but what about the next generation? And this is a very important question that is the heart of the faith that I represent, as well as a central question about humanity. In terms of, as a Muslim, food, as many others have talked about, is a central part of an attraction. You know already that during the month of Ramadan, the holy month of Ramadan, where we all go for prayers in the evening, and then we all eat together. And during COVID, it really highlighted the fact that none of us could go to and congregate and socialize and eat together. And that representation of that community, that social cohesion, that everybody, doesn't matter who they are, where they're from, what is the color of their skin, it doesn't matter. Whether you are a Muslim, whether you're Jewish, whether you are Christian, we invited anybody and everybody to attend. And we always did that in our mosque in North Harrow. But this time it didn't happen. And the mosques, who were spending thousands of pounds of food during Ramadan, decided to feed the homeless and those who had to stay at home. Now, that was all about feeding the hungry, and there was a huge and real need to do that. But it doesn't solve the problem. And just like, Randy, when I heard him speak a few years back, I was also in corporate life. I also reflected just the way he did. And I took a sabbatical from where I was. I worked for a company called Sky. Everybody knows that company. And I went searching for something. Don't know what it was. And I was fortunate that I met a person called Garka Mohammed Mamdani, who is a serial launcher of charities in the UK. He launched many, many charities, and he had a vision that he needed to create something that was not only going to feed the hungry, not only deal with hunger, but the causes of hunger. And 7 years ago, Sufra was born, and I became one of its founding trustees. And the idea for Sufra was, as Philomena, you mentioned, was supposed to be more than a food bank. And the reason was that food actually brings you, when somebody is hungry, they need help. They don't think about anything else. Food is a central survival mechanism. And when people come in to, looking for food, they're absolutely desperate. They could be sleeping on the street, but they need food. Yeah, and they come to. And the whole idea of Sufra was to build from that foundation. And I'll tell you a story. We were giving out our third food parcels to a homeless person, and we gave them this pack full of cans of beans, etc., etc. And he looked at us and said, "That's wonderful, but I don't even have a can opener." Right now, what that told you, and this is the story of Sufra. And we decided that not only do we want to give food, but we wanted to teach how people to cook, right? So we started Food Academy courses, which were a first sign of employability courses that we started. That grew into, barista courses, etc. And the idea was that if we found out what people really wanted, people wanted to get out of poverty, then that's what we needed to help them with. And to be honest with you, food was just a bait. And Sufra started 7 years ago to address that. And it was the first time, a Muslim organization that I know of that thought about how progressively we can move from just feeding to getting people out of poverty. And 4 Muslim charities and organizations decided to seed fund Sufra before, before 3 years later it became independent. And the idea that Sufra, although it came from its Muslim roots, it represented humanity, and it represented, the diverse community that we actually represent, that we serve as our guests. And we have a board now which is as diverse from different faiths, not just from a single faith. And we have volunteers from different faiths. We have volunteers who represent no faith, but simply a faith of humanity, which is wonderful. And that brings us all together. So we now, want, and although it started from Muslim root, it is designed pretty much to serve humanity. And as you mentioned earlier on, Philomena, that, we've started to address lots of things with Sufra and from Sufra. So you mentioned, the edible garden. And again, we understood that giving people just cans of, beans and vegetables and fish and whatever, without providing healthy diet, was just making them even more ill. So how could we create a garden that we can give them fresh vegetables and etc.? How do we use that space for better mental health issues? Because a lot of the people who came to us, had challenges. They all do. They're stressed. What do you expect them? You don't expect them to be smiling and asking for food. They need to be able to have a space for peace, for rest, for calm, and to help them also become gardeners. We have people who run gardening courses, all sorts of things like that. So the idea was to make people become more self-sufficient. Now, there's a realization here, and I'm sure we'll debate this, which is when you're addressing hunger, you are dealing with people not only having issues with with food, mental health. They can't pay their bills. They don't have a roof over their heads. And the idea was we had to address all of those things. People losing their benefits, people going from no job to a job and waiting 4 to 6 weeks before they get their first paychecks and their benefits close. What happens to them? So we had to create an advice worker facility, a program, and that led to lots of other things. We also were asked to help with the refugee resettlement program. So Sufra has grown organically, and the whole ethos behind Sufra is not only do we want to feed people, we want to get people back on their feet. And the ambition is not to just get this generation out of poverty, but can we focus on the next generation, the children, so we don't create a perpetual cycle of them seeing their parents not getting out of this mire and they sit there. And that's why that laptop project and things like that were all part of getting people educated and moving them forward. So that's a potted history of how Sufra came about, what we stand for, and what we're trying to achieve.
Thank you, Asim. That was really heartening to hear that story of your charity's kind of evolution again. And I'm going to hold on to that line that I just think is brilliant, that food is a bait. It's about moving people, as you say, from a sort of band-aid response to something much more sustainable and long-term. And that brings us that challenge that you've kind of set us there, Asim, in terms of Sufra's practice. Brings us to one of the first questions that we've got in our Q&A that's a lovely segue. So to all the panelists, we had a question from one of our participants, Lisa Dresner, and she writes that the overriding thing she's hearing from the presentations is a real lack of political will to change anything apart from elastoplast provided by charities. And her question is, how can we take all this energy to really influence government policy and create long-term change? So if we start with Hannah, and if you'd like to respond to that question, Hannah.
Yeah, I think local governments are certainly recognising the need on the ground more than they have before. At the beginning of lockdown, I said, yo, you need to declare us essential, and they did. And suddenly we were a partner that they really needed, and we've been asked to do 7-day-a-week services. We've been asked to inform on various directions of projects. We've been linked with various other initiatives. So now that there's this need, we are in a very influential position. I've been trying to push for more a better pathway for homeless and vulnerable people to access nutrition from a clinical perspective, not just from a public health perspective that Feast provides, like a general community meal, but actually an individual one-to-one support for the individual on how to look after their own nutrition outside of an organisation. So I've been trying to streamline the government's nutrition screening and I think we are in a merciless position, but we are also now being looked to do something at a higher, more wider reaching level. So I'm using my own position to do something. But I think charities maybe are now a little more responsible for speaking up, wanting to partner to do the same work, to talk to each other better, to communicate better, to share the same data, and to sing and dance about the wonderful things we're doing, but actually to put that into something standardized that local government can say, yep, I really like this, let's roll it out wide scale. I didn't articulate that very well. I hope that answers your question, Lisa.
Randy, would you like to add to Hannah's response to that question from your perspective?
Yeah, I think I completely echo what Hannah's just said, and you know, to add to that, you know, I think the key word here is that we need to be showing that we are action is the word. If we show that we are acting, that, you know, why are we acting, why do we need to be doing what we're doing? So if the government can see we're doing something, there must be a problem. Like Hannah said, you know, we've been engaging, especially through COVID now. I mean, you know, before it was a case of the, you know, why are these people coming onto our streets and feeding? And when COVID kicked in, can you come 7 days a week? Can you do a lunch service? Can you do a morning service? Can you do a tea service? So I think we're getting there slowly.
Father Dominic?
Yes, I agree entirely as well. That's been my experience, and it's been the experience of COVID, which has brought about this this new relationship between local authorities, certainly in central London, and faith groups and other homeless and food agencies who are helping the destitute. Certainly, you know, we've been asked now to start a new service starting on Saturday, which will be 2 days a week of lunch. But also trying to be creative around that and using our skills, the skills of the Catholic community for mental health services, employment advice, art therapy, not just as, you know, John Bird, the founder of The Big Issue, says, giving a hand out, but giving a hand up. So I think there's the government has said it wants to end rough sleeping forever. It's part of this government's manifesto. And really help the poor to come out of destitution. And I think this is a time when faith groups and agencies can work more closely together with local authorities and national government.
Yeah, I think the challenge that we face here is that I think the government are relying on charities to pick up things that they can't look after themselves or want to assist. And, you know, if you want to really deal with poverty, then, you know, you have a fantastic, you know, set of data that's coming out of COVID right now, you know, that should be able to focus people's mind, especially the government's mind. And although charities are doing so much, you know, it takes Marcus Rashford to get people, to get the government to make a U-turn on free school meals for children while they're off school. It's a child poverty or dealing with poverty has to be, you know, something we all need to be putting pressure on the government to do. And I think them giving us a bit of money here and a bit of money there is just making us, you know, it's not helping the problem. You know, we've got over 1 million children who have no digital access in the United Kingdom. Sorry, in England alone, forget United Kingdom, right? Okay, these are children are falling behind on their education. They're not getting the support they need. They don't have, 22% of households have no broadband in this country. You know, it is ridiculous. We're the 5th largest economy in the richest economy in the world, and yet we have 22% of households who cannot get. And these are the same people who can't get access to cheaper, you know, not only education, but, you know, utilities and banking and stuff like that. And the problem is, we all are shouting about it, right? And the fact is, we really need to get, you know, even as a group, whether it's faith or charities across all of this area, to deal with the causes and have advocacy as a big part of what we do, is to put pressure on the government to provide free broadband to children, to provide laptops and access to children they're into. You know, you're not giving people the life chances. And I might be going on a hobby horse here, but this is crazy. You know, we are not dealing with the root causes, and neither is the government. It's just paying lip service. And we can't pick all these things up ourselves. It's just too big for us.
Thank you, Asim, for that challenging response. The original questioner has come back, Lisa, and she's listened to your responses, and she said, sorry to come back on this, but surely poverty is lack of income. And unless we raise our voices and say we need people not to be poor, which is about higher wages, security of employment and higher social security, the government will not look at what is being done and make it better. Would anyone like to respond to Lisa further?
Yeah, I think you're totally right. It is a wider societal issue, and unfortunately in most local governments, food poverty doesn't have a leader or a figure or a dedicated food lead. There's a housing lead, there's an education lead, there's different leads. That environmental health is often where Feast falls, because we're a food business, but we're not. We're a charity supporting people who otherwise would have no access to nutrition. So there needs to be a food lead. And there was the food czar, I can't remember his name, a couple of years ago, and they created food poverty action plans, and there was a very small budget for local councils and the Greater London Authority to support food poverty action plans being rolled out. It has been at the whim of the local government for each borough to decide whether they take on or craft or create a food poverty action plan. Now more than ever, Camden is listening, Haringey is listening, and Islington want to work with us too. And I've been shouting, what are you doing about your food poverty action plan? Here's a whole scheme that is meant to be set up by you guys. Let us inform you, let us help you what is happening on the ground and implement that into your policy. I think the barrier is often lack of funding, and that's the justification for stagnance and for lack of forward movement. And so therefore it bounces back to charities like us to pick up that frontline work. But really it does need to be structured. The food poverty action plans do need to come into play at the local level. So fortunately Camden and Haringey have been listening and working with us throughout lockdown, and I saw a question that kind of pertains to that further down from Lior, which says what will happen to services after lockdown. I think there'll be devastation well after lockdown. You know, talking about remission, people will be hungry and dependent on services for a long time. I'm sure these services that us grassroots charities are running will be embedded by that time, because they'll recognise that the need isn't going to go away. I mean, let's hope that's what the sensible local governments do.
So another, Father Dominic?
I think that that there's just an absolutely huge amount that we can all do, not in our communities, not just in actually providing food services, but also in advocacy. I think that I know Catholic parish communities, you know, the more that they can, in addition to providing food services, can also write to their local councillors, can write to whoever is responsible for poverty, who's responsible for rough sleeping in that local area. Let them know what they're doing and engage them in a conversation. And that can be very forthright and saying, you know, this is which exactly is what it is. It's a blot on our society. You know, it's an affront to human dignity for people of faith, for any human being in our society, that it shouldn't be, it just shouldn't be there. And you know, the more that we can develop that relationship with local authorities and with national government in communities, writing to MPs, writing to ministers, getting meetings. You know, Citizens UK do a wonderful job of that, I know, through in London, London Citizens, of organising people. But individual communities can organise themselves that way. I know justice and peace groups in the Catholic Church around the diocese and in other dioceses can do this. And you know, this is a great opportunity, I think, to really be at the table and be part of the conversation and to get our points across.
So the Q&A is buzzing with questions coming through, and some really interesting provocative questions too that follow on from the discussion we've just been having. So I'd like to ask panelists 2 questions. One from an attendee who says, are we letting the government off the hook by feeding those going hungry? Is it the job of faith groups to do this at all? And related to that, a second person asks, by providing food aid, could this potentially be undermining the possibility of government strengthening local welfare assistance schemes, for example, which were designed to assist those in need locally? So it's this whole tension that we've been talking about, and you've picked up on in your presentations about, by providing faith groups providing food aid, are we inadvertently contributing to the problem we're trying to solve? If anyone would like to respond to that. Randy?
Yeah, if I can just, are we letting the government off the hook? See, I'm going to answer this, and it might be very controversial in the way that I do answer this, but I think the government are providing us an opportunity to serve humanity. If they're not going to step in and we're stepping in, then we've got the opportunity to do that. We wouldn't be here having this conversation if the government were perfect, but we don't live in a perfect world. So, you know, are we letting the government off the hook? I don't think we're letting them off the hook. I think it's more of that we need to work with the government need to work with us, and we need to work together in cohesion. We need to try and solve the problem, because I don't think it's not the responsibility, you know, it's not the responsibility just of the government as a good human being. It's all of our responsibilities to address this problem. So I don't think we're letting the government off the hook. As well as, see, if we were to say, okay, we're going to stop doing what we're doing because it's the government's responsibility, then who would suffer? It would be the poor people that are not getting their food. So yeah, I just wanted to just make that one point.
Thank you, Randeep. Anyone else?
Yeah, I think Ranjit is right that you know, I think it's very difficult if you're looking at it from a faith perspective. You know, every faith, and we go back to what everybody has said, we all want, fundamentally, if we're coming through from a faith perspective, is to help others. Yeah, and we don't want to see people hungry. We don't want people to suffer, and that's, you know, that's kind of the moral basis of a lot of the, you know, all the religions that we you know, that are here today, and others who are not represented. So you can't really, nobody's going to just say, well, we're not going to do that and let the government deal with it. I think, you know, so you're always going to have that balance. I think the point I made earlier was that while we are trying to help and do our moral duty as human beings, it's a government's duty to put in the infrastructure in place behind it to support those people and empower them and get them out of poverty. You know, through you know, through the, you know, investing in education, or you know, through investing, as I mentioned, in infrastructure, etc., to get people out of it. I talked about digital access earlier on. So there are different levels, and people that can play different parts in this. And the government has to look at the bigger picture around what they can do to get people out of poverty by building their infrastructure. The charities and other organizations can play their part. We all have to play a part. We will never, from a faith perspective, ever be able to remove ourselves from helping the others. It just goes against the grain.
Father Dominic?
I think this is a really important question, and I think that we we need to look at it from the perspective of working together, you know, as has been said, with local government. As someone pointed out in the chat, it's national government's problem, and we should go to them as well. Often local authorities and national government are playing one off against the other, perhaps. We don't know exactly where the fault might lie. But at the same time, I think we have to also, and I would like to think that British society and in London recognises that vast number of people are actually religious. This is, you know, if you look at the demographics, that's actually changed considerably, even over the last 10, 15 years, that there are more people who call themselves religious, of all the different faiths, religions in London, than there are in the north. And certainly that's been the case in the Catholic Church, where there's been a shift there. So I think in a multicultural, multi-faith society, you know, I think we need to be confident as well of our place in society. And so we have a duty also to, and our leadership has a duty to look at government policies and what's actually being done, and to point out where we think that that's not humane, and where that is against the what to us is about a civilization of love, is about whatever we would call it in our own religion. We're all agreed that the human being is made in God's image, has a special dignity, well, not all religions agree human beings made in God's image, but the main Abrahamic religions do. But certainly we all believe in this principle of human dignity, which is absolutely central. And I think we have the right to challenge government, and we can be confident about that, recognizing that we're not perfect, that we're sinners, that the churches, certainly, it's my own church, isn't perfect by any means. We all know that. But we should have that confidence to be able to have a robust dialogue with government about these issues.
There's another interesting question in the Q&A that I'd like to ask you about from your practitioner perspectives, and that's from Alex Collis, who says, are you seeing an increase in in-work food poverty recently? And if so, on what scale? It's certainly an issue for Alex in Cambridge.
Without alienating any participants, it's hard to collect data. We don't want to ask, what's your background? What's your salary? Where are you from? How many kids do you have? It's just not in the ethos. If you're welcoming someone for dinner, you want it to be welcoming. You don't want to alienate anybody. So notoriously, collecting data for this group as a fluid and transient community is very difficult. What we do know is that hidden hunger is growing. And what we mean by that is people who may not declare themselves as people suffering food poverty. They don't want to be seen to be needy or asking for help. Suffering food poverty is stigmatized. It's not cool. And people don't like, particularly in England, to ask for help or to talk about how they really feel. It's often the groups from, I mean, I'm just speaking from Feast's perspective. The people who are asking for help are normally not from the UK, and they're not ashamed to ask. And that's very interesting, but that's very anecdotal. So what I would comment there is that unless you have a program where you're sitting down and collecting information, demographic information from the people who are coming through the door, it's very difficult to ascertain exactly how much hidden hunger there is. But I would, just looking at the volume of people coming through, irrespective of their background or their socioeconomic situation, and the fact that the volume is growing, I would infer that there are more people suffering who are in work, as it were.
Randeep, are you seeing a similar trend?
Yeah, so if I can just say that, so that we have a no questions asked service. It's you come, you take, you go, because to stand in a queue an hour before we arrive, and then to stand for another hour before you're served, because sometimes we're serving up to 300 people a night, you must have a good reason for it. You must have a good reason for it. And, you know, I've come across people dressed very, very smartly with a briefcase and an umbrella. And the question has not been asked, what are you doing here? You look okay, but maybe in a different way. What brings you here? How can we help you further? And, you know, with this person with a briefcase and the umbrella, very smartly dressed, it transpired that this person was living in a tent and going to work every day and had a £15 a month membership for a gym where that person would shower. And that's just one example of hundreds of people that are coming to use the service. You know, there was another person who, again, we engaged in a conversation, and the person said, you know, I had to weigh up, do I spend my last £10 on food, or do I spend my last £10 for this week on electricity? And the person said, I'm going to spend it on electricity to keep warm, because I know I can come here 5-6 days a week for food from you guys. So these are the type of examples, and these are the type of scenarios that we're dealing with. And so, you know, you never judge a book by its cover, never. You just don't know what's happening behind the scenes.
Thank you, Andy. Dominic, or would you like to come in on this question of in-work poverty?
Yeah, I mean, the in-work poverty has even before COVID, and I think it's going to get worse. And I think the underlying cause of that has also been that people are not getting paid the minimum wage or the living wage. So you've got, you know, there are still people out there who are not paying the London living wage or not paying the minimum wage. Yeah, and people are finding it very, very difficult to live on what they've got. And so, you know, there's also this huge, there's also has to be some realization of how we can get small businesses, medium-sized businesses to pay fairly to their workers, because there are many who are not doing that. And we see that people coming to us who, when we find out, because obviously when we're giving people advice, we're trying to understand their circumstances so we can help them. And in-work poverty has shot through the roof in terms of the number of people we see. We haven't got the latest figures during COVID period, but previous to that, I believe about 18% of our guests were in that category. I can always come back with the exact figure, but I believe it was around that from memory. And there are also those before COVID where people were on benefits looking to go to work, and their benefits had stopped, and so therefore they themselves you would classify as in work poor, because their paycheck would come 4 to 6 weeks after. So, you know, they just didn't have anything coming in, benefits not coming in, you know, their first paycheck not coming in. So you have temporary, but you also have, you know, people who are in there a lot. So, you know, I think that's going to grow as well further. So yes, we're seeing that as a growing trend.
Thank you. Perhaps moving on to another question that's come in through the Q&A, and this is possibly for practitioners who engaging on the question of the ethics of the use of surplus food in food relief. And the question comes from an attendee who asks, is feeding the hungry on food waste the solution to food waste, or could it be contributing to the food industry becoming more complacent about dealing with their food waste? So I don't know if there are any practitioners who are using surplus food and would like to reflect on that from their practice.
Yeah, go on, Effie.
Go on, Hannah. You go for it, Hannah.
I was going to say that every collaborator, every partner, every retailer that we partner with is really keen for charities to take the surplus. The surplus is a byproduct of a multitude of problems throughout the food system, moving away from the food chain, which implies a linear cause of losses. But actually the food system, all the different parts of it, manufacturers, farmers, middlemen. It's all interlinked, nationally and globally. So there are many causes for food waste. I don't think it's about anybody being complacent. It's about very difficult legislation to break, and there's no one blame. There's just lots of waste that we should tap into as charities, because we're broke and we need to use the resources around us. And I think it would almost be a little reductionist or dismissive to sort of put this surplus in a category of, oh, it's waste, we shouldn't be giving people waste. It almost comes across as snobby to think that we should be throwing this food away, because this is perfectly good food. It's just been marketed or framed as something that people can do better. If you get my meaning, I'm not sure I've explained myself well, but the notion that waste is somehow a resource that isn't a resource, that's actually something we shouldn't be using, is actually a shame, I think. And maybe as a people, we need to reframe that and look at the world around us. And coming back to Jewish principles and sustainability, appreciating the world that we're in, the notion of never cutting down a tree, because the tree bears fruits and it has roots and it also brings shelter, and the idea that for generations to come, that one tree could be a savior and a branch. So using the resources around us, I think, is essential at this time. I hope that answers the question.
Asim?
Yeah, and I just, Hannah, that was beautiful. I think that, perfectly summed up, and I'm glad you said what you did, because exactly that's how we feel. Just adding to that further, I mean, again, from a religious perspective, wasting food is a no-no. It's just, and it's always about, there are hungry people out there, and you're wasting your food. We tell that to our children. It's kind of that ethos. But what I would say is that, and Sufra uses, food that's going to be thrown away, and give a big plug to Waitrose and M&S in Brent Cross, who kindly provide us with that stuff that we pick up, and we give to people who need it. Now, you can't, and they give flowers as well, and flowers cheer people up as well. It's just like just food, you're not wasting stuff. But I think I wanted to just raise one more thing, again, going from a political perspective. In France, I think a couple of years ago, they made a law that ensured that any food waste, that any food that was wasted or was surplus in supermarkets or restaurants, etc., would be given to deserving causes. Okay, and what that's done is that's also reduced the amount of waste as well, because they're buying more sensibly. They don't want to throw stuff away, because they're logistically, the supermarkets and these have to find, they have to distribute that. It's not just somebody has to collect it. They've got to get rid of that. They're penalized if they don't actually, sensibly get rid of that waste in a proper way, and they have to give it to the right people. And it's things like that that we need to look at. We're too health and safety conscious in this country, whereby we think we're going to, harm somebody, right, and somebody's going to die. I'm afraid the hungry are not going to sue anybody. They're dying anyway, right? I'm sorry to be controversial, but they're not. They need food on the table, and what we've got to do is find a way of doing that. If the scheme is working in France, why can't we actually look at that in this country? And that's really important. That's going to actually provide more food, and we don't have enough money, and that is a contribution from what do you call it? Different supermarkets, etc., that could actually help our cause rather than hinder.
Asim, can I just add to that, because I forgot to say about France being ahead of the game, and parts of Germany as well. I think it's a fantastic initiative. It helps us reframe what surplus is, and rather than it being shunned as waste, they've now saved it from waste and turned it into surplus, which has a secondary purpose. Absolutely, we are behind the rest of Europe in that sense, but it is a legislation thing, and that shapes how people see it. It's a resource we can tap into.
Absolutely.
Randy, did you want to come in?
I just, if I understood the question correctly, are the food providers becoming complacent? I think the short answer is I don't think they are. they're in the business of making money as well as providing good food. So I don't think they'll become complacent if they're going to be losing money. So that's just what I want to say.
Okay. I'm going to abuse my privilege as chair to ask the panelists all a question now. And that is, all of you in your different ways have been looking into the future and seeing the trends getting worse, seeing the level of demand for your service increase, and expecting your capacity as charities to cope with that increased demand, be really precarious going forward. So if overnight you were put in charge of government policy and could implement one new COVID pandemic response from national government, what would you be doing to ease the scandal of food insecurity that every day you're dealing with?
If I can go first, if you don't mind, because I've actually thought about this question many times, and I'm thinking that if we look at the infrastructure that we have within the UK and the infrastructure, let's just take schools, for example, just the schools alone. Every school has a kitchen, and those kitchens are not used throughout the whole day. They're not used in the evenings. They're only used probably once a day. They're not used on the weekends. So why not create employment at the same time and utilize that infrastructure? And see, with this, if you go to a Sikh temple, one thing you will have is so anybody listening to this, if you're ever hungry, walk past the Sikh temple, go in, no questions asked, eat food, go out, go lunch, dinner, breakfast, however many times you want. If we can implement that same concept in every single school, non-school times, I think we could solve a lot of our problems.
Thank you, Randeep. That sounds like a brilliant policy to me. Anyone else?
Yeah, Randeep, totally. We had that thought at the beginning of lockdown when everything seemed to be falling apart and community centres were closing and the supermarket stores were drying up. We're thinking, how are we going to feed all these people? And it really, that thought crossed our minds, where are the kitchens that we can use? So that's lovely that there's such a strong thread within the Sikh community about feeding others. I would be rolling out nutrition screening for every person who is on the street. If they don't have a shelter, they probably haven't eaten properly for a very long time. Let's just check how malnourished they really are, and then they can be triaged there and then. It's a crime that we don't look at nutrition, or that people don't know what a dietitian is, and that we are here, we're readily accessible on the NHS to help people with their nutrition. So if we make that service more accessible and we know how malnourished people are and the priority, how long have they been eating poorly, is it related to alcohol and malnutrition that way, is it tied in with a poor relationship with food and their mental health? Can we triage them into a proper service where they get the dietetic support they need, rather than just bunging them into the local feast? Or that, feast is great and all these other initiatives are great, but providing tailored nutrition for people, I think I would be looking at policies that really screen for malnutrition from the street there and then.
Great, Hannah, thank you. Father Dominic?
I'd like to say something which offers hope as well, which is coming out of the experience of the pandemic. Certainly for us, we've found that so many hotels and restaurants and businesses in central London have wanted to help. And that's increasingly the case. People actually contact us now. About 3 or 4 restaurants, businesses have contacted us just in the last week to say, we'd like to help you. We realize the situation. They are actually struggling as well, of course. And so there are really good people there, even in the hospitality industry, which is really struggling, really wanting to help here. So I think what I would want to try to do as well would be to on a wider scale regarding not just food but shelter as well, and the whole package of actually providing human care for those who are left on the streets. and find a way to make property available, which there's so much empty property around there. One of the really good, around in central London, one of the really good things about the pandemic with the Everyone In scheme was that those homeless who actually were housed found that because they were being fed, because they were being cared for, because they were being treated as human beings, they actually began to flourish. And it showed that there was something that we could really do. So I want to try and find some way in which that became part of government policy. And that would also involve something in the background as well, with regard to how money's allocated and how people are viewed in this hostile environment. So benefits will be a big thing there. Ending the rule of no recourse to public funds for particular people of particular status, usually to do with immigration, and also reinstating the ban on evicting those who are in rented accommodation at this time of pandemic. It's actually a scandal that at this time of a great health crisis, that we have policies which are still putting people at such great risk and putting society at risk.
Thank you, Father Dominic. It's good to think about hopeful responses to, and working in partnership.
Well, absolutely. In the world of the utopia that we're talking about here, I think I echo what Father Dominic mentioned. I think if I was to look at the policies, I would definitely want to take this opportunity to get every homeless person off the street. And how we do that, whether we tax extra, whatever the case may be, we need to make a concerted effort to get people off the street and give them as much help as possibly can, and get them off the street. This is just not, we shouldn't be living in a society where we find people that are still sleeping on the street, and I think that's just a horrible thing. I would definitely look at the policies that could change that for good, and we all need to play a part in it. If we have to pay extra tax, we should be doing that to actually fund that. I also think child poverty, is huge. It's how can we have children going hungry? In Brent, 100,000 families live, and 1 in 4 child in that borough is barely having 1 meal a day, and that's probably when they're at school. I mean, how could we do that? So we really need to focus on child poverty, and I commend Marcus Rashford and what he's doing to highlight this stuff. Not a single child should be going without food, and we should be providing benefits to them, to be able to get that, so that at least the families and parents can feed their children. And I think I talked about also about, and I'm not, going and harping on about this, but I'm going to say it for the third time. I think to get people out of poverty, you have to focus on education. And I think the infrastructure that I talked about and making that free for every family, digital access, is huge. And that should be a policy we should all be going for, because getting children out of poverty, next generation, is important. And we should never forget the next generation. We keep focusing on the existing one. We need to focus on the future. Otherwise, we don't have a future.
Thank you, Asim. Unfortunately, we're coming towards the end of our time together. Apologies to everyone on the who submitted questions via the Q&A that we weren't able to get to this time. But I think what it shows for me is that the faith-based response to feeding people in the UK is huge and diverse and varied. There are all sorts of areas where we align in terms of our utopian visions for the future. I'd elect you all into government tomorrow based on those responses about the future. And I really think what we need to do is to have more conversation.
Oh, I think we've lost Philomena. Has anyone else?
I think we've lost Philomena, yeah?
Oh!
Oh no, we've lost the connection.
We've lost that.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh dear.
Well, I guess this is our license to become part of government now, guys. Let's do it.
The newly elected government.
I think we make them bankrupt the way we're going.
I don't know if someone from Sustain wants to wrap it up, or...
That's a good idea.
Hello. I think we had some technical problems there from Philomena, and she was on such a brilliant role there. And I don't think I'm going to be able to do justice to anything that she was about to say whatsoever. But just a big thank you to all of the panelists. It was a really, really interesting discussion, and really interesting to hear all of those points and some of the complexities of it all. I think there's some really nuanced conversations that need to happen, but it's clear that there's a lot of energy in the room amongst the brilliant panelists, and also everybody who came to make this change and to make feeding the hungry something that is not just about feeding that immediate need, but also thinking about the longer term and addressing the root causes of this issue in the first place, so that the next generation, as was said so beautifully, the next generation doesn't have to face this issue as the current generation does. And I think that although it's a difficult time right now, as has been outlined, and this problem has been heightened by COVID, it is also a time when a greater sense of awareness about it has come out of it. And I think for me, that's the silver lining, that people are paying attention to this issue more. So yes, it's a shame that we lost our brilliant chair for the last few seconds, but thank you everyone for attending, and thanks to all of the panelists. As it is 7:30, I will end the event now, but thanks everyone for coming, and we'll send a update with the recording and everything at the in the next couple of days.
Thank you. Please stay in touch. It would be lovely to work together with any of the panelists and the attendees as well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Pleasure meeting you all. Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Bye.
Brilliant to meet you all. And thanks for all the attendees. I'm going to end the call now, but have a wonderful evening, everyone.
God bless you.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.